The United States looks as if it's reached a compromise on lifting its debt ceiling. That's the amount of money the US is allowed to owe by law. America's been in danger of running out of funds to service government loans. And as part of a political deal to avoid that, President Obama's agreed to drastic spending cuts. Even though the crisis is probably over in the short term, the American economy is still in dire straits, and that has big implications for global economics and politics. For one take, I spoke earlier to Paul Wolfowitz, most recently the president of the World Bank, and before that, America's Deputy Defence Secretary. He's in Australia to speak at the Centre for Independent Studies. Paul Wolfowitz, welcome to the program.
Nice to be here.
I'd like to start with the matter that's preoccupying the US at the moment, which are the efforts to raise the debt ceiling. The Nobel economist Paul Krugman says that the deal takes America a long way down the road towards banana republic status. What do you think?
I think that's ridiculous. I think actually what we've seen is a rather impressive display of the democratic process at work, actually. Australians ought to understand this. Big, noisy debate is not a bad thing. It's a sign of getting the issues on the table. And I think the country as a whole is really confronting the fact that if we keep spending the way we've been spending, we'll end up at some point in the position of Greece when it's too late to do anything about it.
Is it the time, though, to cut spending quite drastically when your economy's in a weakened position?
I think it's important. First of all, I think you have to start doing it. Secondly, I think a lot of this spending has been extremely inefficient. If you do the arithmetic, even with the administration's own official figures on so-called job creation or jobs saved out of the $800+ billion stimulus, it comes out to somewhere between $150,000 and $250,000 a job. I think that what is really needed now is to build business confidence, to get people investing.
When you've got a debt at the size it is, $14 trillion odd dollars in the United States, I mean, how do you even begin to get that under control, particularly when you've got a couple of costly wars being waged overseas?
I'm sorry, it's not the wars that are adding to the debt. And the real problem, actually, the huge increase in the last few years has been a kind of explosion in healthcare benefits and retirement benefits. And politicians have been afraid to touch that for years. It was called the third rail of American politics. Well, they're still afraid of it, but I think we're finally coming to realization that we're just... And interestingly, the younger generation, the 20-year-olds and the 30-year-olds, are realizing that it's a false promise that they're going to get taken care of in their old age unless the system gets fixed. And fixing means some reduction in the magnitude of those benefits and some indexing for, at the moment, things like Social Security. You get it regardless of what your income. So there needs to be fixes to Social Security, there needs to be fixes to Medicare. People realize it.
Sorry to interrupt, but what administration, Democrat or Republican, is going to be able to convince the public, OK, well, we're going to make cuts to Social Security and healthcare, but we're going to keep spending billions of dollars on a war in Afghanistan? It's a hard argument to make to the public.
Look, I think the public generally understands that what's at stake in Afghanistan is American security, number one. Number two, we are moving, I think, on a pretty rapid trajectory toward handing that off to the Afghans, which is where, frankly, probably should have been on that trajectory earlier. And the war in Iraq is winding down. If you eliminated the entire defense budget, you would have some fiscal benefits, but I don't think there's any American that believes we would be safe if we did something that radical.
How much do you think America's economic woes are going to undermine its political leadership in global circles? Is it going to be too distracted by what's going on at home to exercise the sort of leadership we've seen in the past internationally?
It could be, and the people who say you can't lead in the world when you're in a mess at home. But, I don't want to overdo the analogy, but in the late 1970s, which you're too young to remember, I was very aware that post-Vietnam, the U.S. was in terrible economic shape as well. We had double-digit inflation. We had very high unemployment. There was a sort of feeling that our leadership role, particularly in Asia, was finished. And frankly, partly because we got very strong messages from Australia that, look, you're needed out here. However you may feel about the terrible experience of Vietnam, it is very important for the U.S. to stay engaged. And we did. And the 1980s turned into a very different era, partly because of Paul Volcker and getting inflation down, getting the economy growing again. It can be done, and I think there's an American spirit that I hope will prevail here again.
If I could turn to another subject, is Australia wise to rely on China's continuing growth for its economic prosperity?
I guess one question is, what's your alternative? I think it's a mistake to rely too much on any one economic factor. It's why investors try to spread their portfolio around. I also think if one had to predict China's economic trajectory, it's bound to slow down. Plus, China is going to face shrinking in its labor force much sooner than people realize because of this draconian one-child policy that only a one-party dictatorship could decree and impose, and it's going to have some strange effects in China, including vastly more men than women in that generation, and a whole generation that has no cousins. And if you can imagine, when you think about how the Chinese economy generally works on familial relationships, and you do what these social engineers have done, I think China's going to have some difficulties. I think it'll keep growing. I think that's a safe bet, but not growing at 9 or 10% for a long time.
What about on the security side? Do you see China posing any sort of security threat to the Asia-Pacific region?
I think threat is the wrong word to use, but I do think China would like to be, at some point in the future, the dominant military power in this region. And I don't say that to, from a Chinese perspective, I suppose that's an entirely reasonable ambition, but from a Korean perspective or a Vietnamese perspective or a Japanese perspective, or I would think an Australian perspective, that's not such a great outcome.
Paul Wolfowitz, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And a longer version of that interview will be available on our website tomorrow.